It looks like we are largely here. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Bill, I saw your text. It looks like you're on and available. Is that right?
I think so. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
You sound good. Would you like
Good.
to go ahead and give us a safety moment?
Yes. Thanks. And I want to thank everybody for coming with us bright and early on this Thursday morning. I think we wanted to use this safety moment to a little bit reflect on those that have been impacted by the Marshall Fire. We know that there's folks that in this group in particular that have been impacted, and we wanted to, one, have our thoughts with those people that have been impacted, but also recognize that, be prepared for things that, happen so quickly because, with this fire, again, there was not much notice or anything, and just having kind of a plan laid out to prepare for these kinds of emergencies. So we just want to recognize, those impacted by the Marshall Fire in this safety moment. So thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, definitely a difficult time. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us this morning. We've got some good material to cover. We're going to spend some time with an update on the system optimization plan. I know several of you have had an opportunity to dig into the details on where the draft system optimization plan sits. Some of you have not, so we're going to give a pretty high level overview, not the route by route overview, because that's several hours long. But we will give a high level overview and talk about the public commenting period and tool that is coming up, and next steps for the system optimization plan. Then we're going to dig into the mobility plan for the future for a bit. We have some analysis and information on how Tabor has impacted RTD's revenues over time from the past, and then we can use that information to project forward how RTD should move forward from a funding perspective. And then we have some updates on parking recommendations as well. So you'll remember that in our last couple of meetings, we've had some information on mobility as a service and first and last mile. We've had updates on the electrification work that's done, and we haven't yet heard from the parking folks. So Walker has joined us today and we'll provide some updates on that. And then of course, we have some updates and information on public engagement and next steps. So I think we may wrap up early, but we'll play it by ear, and I'd like to make sure that we have enough opportunity for good conversation. So Doug, I believe you are up to take us through some SOP updates.
Great. All right, so we kicked off the system optimization plan in late 2019. And I guess the first question is, why are we doing a system optimization plan? Well, RTD hasn't done a comprehensive look at the route network since the late 1970s, when it switched from kind of a hub and spoke system to the grid system that we've been operating for the last 40 years or so. So it was time to take a look at how the whole system worked and how it interacted with each other. And we've done a lot of small plans as fast tracks lines have opened up and we've reconfigured bus service, but haven't really looked at the whole system. So this was an opportunity for us to look at the entire bus and rail system to try to change some things listed here, reversing and mitigating trends of ridership loss, improving performance, and then ensuring fiscal sustainability. There have been a lot of changes in travel markets over the years, and especially through COVID, as we've noticed how people continue to use the system. So, taking all those into account to remain competitive and improve service quality are what we were looking at with the SOP. About a year or so ago, we wrapped up the comprehensive assessment of services, and that gave us an idea of what was working well and what wasn't on the existing services. And using that, we took our ridership and the location-based services data and looked at where people were going from and traveling to, working with our finance group to see what resources we actually have available, and working with with the board and community groups for their wants and needs on this as well. So now we have a draft system optimization plan that is ready to be commented on by you and by anybody in the public to see what you think of it, and how it would work for our system. So the SOP recommendations, the principles that we're going on, and one of the first things we looked at was how the travel markets work with the family of services that we had. And previously, the family of services kind of focused on land use directly along the routes, and it was pretty rigid as far as how routes were compared to each other. So the SOP is proposing that those family of services actually be modified into more travel market-based categories that focus on service and frequency rather than trying to base service directly off of what the density along the routes are. Supporting well-defined transit transfer hubs for connectivity. That's a big one, and I'll get to that add a little bit more to that when we get to the reliability portion here. But maintaining clock-based headways is another big portion of it. The clock-based headways are basically headways that repeat every hour. So, every on the hour and half hour, or, on the hour and 15 minutes, half hour, 45 past. And those allow for consistent service. Makes it easy for passengers to remember, but it also allows us to provide strong connections in the system as well. When everything is operating in some factor of 15 minutes or so, the routes always cross each other at relatively the same time after the hour to provide those convenient connections. So maintaining that, as RTD has done for many years, is a big portion of the plan. And then having consistent minimum spans of service for all of our routes. In going into the bus route design, simplification was a big theme, keeping routes generally on the straightest and most easy to understand path for the customers, getting rid of some deviations where they don't, getting rid of deviations where it takes it off of the main route and can cause confusion for passengers and delays for passengers that have to ride through there. Going for consistency and getting rid of irregular trip patterns like short turns in many cases, and having consistent service spans across the day. And then reliability. So looking at eliminating long routes, and we're not saying eliminating service along those corridors necessarily, but splitting up routes into two routes, basically, that allows for better reliability on both routes. So that goes back to having well-defined transit transfer hubs where those splits occur, to allow for those convenient connections in between those routes. But at the same time, when we look at splitting routes in two as well, we're generally doing it at locations where there's already not a lot of through ridership. It's generally at rail stations where a lot of passengers are either transferring to another bus route or transferring onto the high capacity rail network. So those are some of the principles that we're looking at when coming up with the draft SOP. Now I talked about the travel market service categories. And so these are the four categories here. Core routes are those routes with the highest service level of service, basically. So those are, regionally focused local bus and rail routes that have a minimum of 18-hour span of service on weekdays, and a minimum, they have 15-minute service all day from the AM peak through the PM peak on weekdays. So if a route is in the core category of service, it always has that level of service. Connect routes are similar to the core routes in that they are regionally focused, but don't have the rigid definition of the span of service and the frequency. So, these are regionally important routes that, make those connections across jurisdictional boundaries and take people, can take people from one side of the district to the other, but at the same time, they don't warrant quite the level of service that that the core routes do. And then commute routes are similar to today's regional routes. They're generally more specialized routes that are focused on specific workplaces. So places like downtown Denver and the DEN airport. So these routes generally focus around work times when people need to, basically the peak hours in the case of downtown especially, and providing those specialized trips out to the airport for all day service. And then the final category is community. These are routes that really aren't as regionally focused as the others. They generally will only serve, one jurisdiction, one municipality, and really have a specialized or a unique level of service tailored to the actual market that it's serving. So community routes can be anything from, the examples here. The 16th Street Mall ride is a community route because of its unique nature operating in downtown Denver, even though it operates every 3 minutes. And then, routes that operate within Longmont and within Boulder that connect to the bigger regional network are part of the community network as well. So that's those are the 4 service categories that are proposed going forward. Moving on to the next slide. So on the right side here, there's a map that's going to be populated. The red lines are rail lines. The yellow lines starting with are the community network. The green lines are the commute network. The orange lines are the connect network. And then adding on top of that, the blue lines are the core network. So you can see how all the different categories of service fit in with each other here, and how they fit in with each other and complement each other throughout the network and create a cohesive network throughout the district. On the left, just some statistics about the system optimization plan. Core routes accounting for about 41% of service hours, and the connect routes accounting for about 40% of service hours, and then 5% for the commute and 14% for the community. A couple notes about the service profile for the proposed SOP. It does have a flatter service profile, and what we mean by that is the amount of service offered in the midday relative to the peak is greater than with the pre-COVID network from RTD. So what that means is more consistent service throughout the day. Many of these routes, especially in the core category, have their midday service levels increased to operate every 15 minutes. Whereas in the past, they might have operated every 15 minutes at the peak, but every 30 minutes in the midday. With this, they'll operate every 15 minutes all day. And that should also have the effect of helping us with workforce retention as well, getting rid of not having as many split shifts because of not needing to have that high peak to base ratio in that case. And then the other thing to note is this is heavy on providing or continuing to provide service to social equity groups, and that's been the case throughout the pandemic, as we've noticed ridership patterns and where people have continued to ride for the last going on 2 years now. It's been in those areas that have the high social equity populations, and this SOP continues to provide a high level of service to those areas. So just a little bit here on what we've heard from stakeholders.
Hey, Doug, just
Yes.
real quick. So it'd be helpful to know if you, in the future, if you could do a comparison map just to know what it used to look like. That would be helpful just to know what the breakdown is. And then I noticed there were a few red marks in there, and wondering if what are those? Just
The red lines are the rail lines. I think they were on the map. Yeah, they're on the
Okay.
map first, and they kind of got covered up by the bus route.
Okay. I
So we
wasn't
added the bus
okay.
route to the map.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Hey, Doug.
Yes.
So I kind of want to talk. Can you go back to that map? I mean, you used some key words in here that concerns me, but you said social equity. I think you've used a couple times.
Mhm.
When I look at your core network, it seems to be like Colfax and South. So when you come through all this process, you know, of course, I represent Arvada in this discussion, and this map probably only penetrates about 25% of my population, and being the 5th largest city in the metro area, only 25% of my community is being serviced by 2027. And sorry, I know Castle Rock is also probably in this topic, but I mean, how do you envision getting ridership if you're just scaling back so far that you're not even penetrating groups within our community that would use the service if it was available? I mean, you're right there. I think if you're looking in my area, I think the furthest west you go is what, Ward Road?
Correct.
You know, I have about 80,000 more people that would love to have access to a bus and who would actually support a bus service and mass transit, along with dovetailing into the greenhouse gas issues that we're all trying to solve.
Right.
I'm just lost on this direction.
Okay.
And I invest a lot in multimodal. The city has put multimodal. We've improved sidewalks. We've widened roads. We've put workforce housing. We've put sidewalks to bus stops that were asked by RTD, and then all of a sudden RTD stops doing it. I just tell me what the deal is, because our taxpayers pay taxes. And I need to know, if we're not doing this, then I need to stop spending money to try to encourage mass transit if you guys are just not investing in my community. I just struggle with this map. I hate seeing this map. Because look at it. It's all blue south. Good for Littleton. Good for Greenwood Village.
Mhm. So
For
we
core
can provide some more metrics, but I can give you a off the cuff. One of the things that we started the process with, that I think are, and we are happy to, I think we should dig in on a route by route basis. We have a finite amount of resources to move around, and we can help with that, and certainly look at and see where we can get the most bang for the buck, right?
Yeah. So I mean, Holly, I know we're trying to focus on, social equity, we'll just say. And yes, there are lower income houses and families that need, and workforce folks that need access to mass transit. But there's also a flip side. We have one of the wealthiest zip codes in the state who is wanting to have mass transit service.
Mm-hmm.
But yet RTD is very clear that they do not want to put one bus in the wealthiest zip code in the metro area, who supports mass transit.
I wouldn't, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I understand where you're coming from. So let's have some dialogue. I think when we want to get into like specific municipalities, we probably need to do that in our service sector areas or some smaller groups, because obviously we're covering the whole region here. But definitely one of the focus areas from the very beginning of Reimagine RTD was suggested that by the technical working group as well as the advisory committee, was that we need to have a priority focus in the SOP on supporting and providing best service we can to service equity, social equity populations. So what we have done increases really great access to social equity. In fact, I don't have the number, but it's something like 15% more of our social equity populations have access to 15-minute or better service under this current system optimization plan, which was a driving factor and an underlying focus provided from the TWG and the AC to the team. So there is definitely a focus on that. And that is in response to what we heard from you all.
And that's your
Now,
core
how we
service,
move
right?
service,
Holly?
around in the other areas, we can continue to have that conversation,
So-
but that is definitely a focus for what we're trying to achieve here.
So Holly, the 15-minute Headways is on your core service, right?
15, it's on some other services as well. But it can be on a connect service, for instance, but all of the cores do have that. And yes, and that was a driving force. The other piece that was definitely an input from the technical working group and the advisory committee was a focus on providing that core backbone network service. RTD, do what you do well, do those core backbone network services, and don't spread yourself so thin that you're not doing anything well. Do well what you do at your core. So those were two driving forces that are influencing the recommendations you're seeing here. So I have some other hands here. Hold on, let me see if I can get in order. Let me see, Tammy.
Thanks, Holly. And Council Member Pfeiffer, if I've got my roads right on this map, the blue is not down in Greenwood Village. I think it's still in Denver, because you can see Centennial down a little further there, and we're right next to Greenwood.
Oh, you're
Village.
right. Sorry, I see Littleton down
Just
there.
a little clarification there. But one thing, Holly, I wanted to ask about was, and I go with what I know. In Centennial, we have a line that's on Arapahoe Road here, and it got switched during the pandemic. And right there at I-25, you have to change and transfer to another bus to stay on Arapahoe Road.
Okay.
Is that taken into account? I know that the direction of this is kind of going with more transfers, but I just am curious, are we taking that into consideration when you're looking at these?
There are, so one thing to be clear, when we talk about having more transfers, we're really trying to focus on having improved reliability. So, when the routes get really long, they get off schedule, obviously, because the longer you're out there, the more, issues you run into. So by providing a really good time transfer, we're able to keep all the buses on schedule just a little bit better. And that, Doug, can you speak specifically to, is it the 66, Tammy, that you're referring to? I'm not sure which.
Yeah, and that is, yeah. So that one was split in, I want to say sometime in 2020, I believe.
Mhm.
And Route 66 runs west of Arapahoe Station, and Route 153 runs east of Arapahoe Station. And that was added, I guess, for reliability reasons for one, and for operational reasons for another, because of that Route 153 bus needed a terminal. So we have to take those into consideration as far as where we can actually turn buses around. And that was really the best option that we had for turning that 153 bus around at Arapahoe Station.
And that's fine. I just know what I know, but I'm just wondering if we're seeing that when we're looking at this regional map and saying, is there transfers in there too? Because we do know that does impact ridership.
And yeah, I mean, we try to avoid them. And like I said, the transfers, where we do split routes like that, obviously this was done prior to the SOP, but it's at locations where there's a high turnover on the bus already. And I know that some passengers, I'm sure, do ride through on Arapahoe Road there and now do have to transfer, but the majority are transferring either to the light rail or to a different bus at Arapahoe Station, which kind of makes it a natural point to do that, to minimize the number of people that are forced to transfer.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Let's see. Commissioner Levy?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. And thanks for the presentation. I guess I have three concerns that I'd like to bring forward about this plan. And so first, I really appreciate your commitment to serving populations for whom RTD is mobility. And I do think that that is part of your core mission, absolutely, and really support trying to make sure that those populations are served. But I think I share a lot of the concerns that Councilman Pfeiffer expressed, in that RTD really needs to bring those riders for whom there are options back into transit. And those are the people who will buy the annual passes, they can pay full fare, and their travel patterns need to be served and need to be changed. And so I think I hope there is some way to balance, if you will, the with your resources serving social equity populations, and also serving the folks who really want to have those travel choices. But the two other comments are, one with respect to the corridor planning work we've been doing in Boulder County on the NAMS corridors, the Northwest Area Mobility Study. And there's been a lot of work that has gone into trying to plan for BRT on Highway 287, on State Highway 7, and we are not seeing that reflected here in your SOP. So I guess I'm wondering, how that work's going to get integrated into this. You do have a reference to the 119 work that's been going on, but there are a lot of resources and a lot of community investment into these other NAMS corridor work. So I'd like to understand that and how that would be integrated. And then the last comment is just about, well, you haven't mentioned it here, but with the goal of 85% service restoration by 2027, our staff has analyzed the routes and the service, and we're seeing within Boulder County it's going to be less than 80% restoration of service. And so you may be looking at that on a system-wide basis, but within Boulder County there's a lot of transit that happens within the county that isn't from Denver to or from Boulder to Denver. It's people really do use RTD for mobility within the county, and so we'd like to see more attention to that, so that the really key routes that, say, CU students and staff are using for transit within Boulder County are there, and so that we within Boulder County get that 85% service. I mean, of course, we'd love to see a much more ambitious target, but those are the three concerns I wanted to address.
Those are great insights. Thank you. I'll circle back on those, because I think there's some more details that need to be reflected there that we can follow up with them. Let's see, Councillor Marvin.
Yes, thank you. So this is thank you for the presentation. It's been helpful. I'm new to the committee, so I've appreciated kind of this overview. So I guess my concern is taking a look at this map. Up in Thornton, we are growing, we're growing a lot, and we have no service. There's no service at all, it seems, north of 120th. And it's always been something that's bothered me, especially as we're growing up there. But we have a whole population, whole huge part of the city, and where all of the growth is going, that there is no service at all. It's not even, consistent service or anything. And so I'm just wondering kind of what the reasoning is behind that, and if there's any plans to expand service to the neighborhoods and cities and communities that are growing, because it's a concern, and it's a problem that if you live north of 120th in the city, you have no mass transit options without having to drive 10-15 minutes to get to any of the bus routes. And we don't have a lot of community connections either, as other people have said, but I think the main thing is we don't even have any service up in the north, and looking at this map, that's not going to be remedied, and that's where all of our growth is.
So I will provide a quick little response for that, and we can have some more follow-up. So RTD does go through a 3 times a year process of evaluating their services and adjusting as growth occurs. So there's always, this is the recommendation for the SOP to 2027, but always RTD is looking at growth and development and how it's changing and growing, because obviously the Denver area's had tons of change and growth over the last few years, especially. So there is always opportunity to continue that discussion. The other thing that is just the reality of what we know from previous services, the modeling of services and the valuation that has occurred to date, is that we get, it's very difficult to capture riders and ridership at the same level in those lower density communities. So when we have a single dollar to spend, where you can actually capture riders and provide that service is in those kind of where you see the core routes, for instance. And when we start to spread the service around and provide less quality service, but around the whole network, and for those of you that are newer to the committee, when we sort of started the process, we did a lot of modeling that shows how ridership really changes when we spread service around the community, when we concentrate it on that backbone kind of service, and then we did several other alternatives as well. And really the lowest ridership is when we start to spread it around. So it's just a real balancing act of where you invest the dollars. But I think we should continue the conversation. Let's dig in and see if there's something that needs to be adjusted within this SOP. And hopefully RCD is not limited to the 85% that Claire mentioned as well. Over time, hopefully we'll get past that and build back up.
I would appreciate if we could have kind of some further conversations, because I have a really hard time that we don't even have anything that connects into downtown north of 100. 120th is our last bus stop, really, and so I just have a very hard time understanding how 144th or 136th, how there's not even an opportunity to have one more stop on our routes that go more of the commuter routes that go into Denver. So I understand kind of balancing those needs, but I mean, even some of that service, there's just no service up there, and it seems like there could be some opportunities to extend some of the other commuter routes by 1 or 2 stops to have some service available for those northern residents.
Great, I appreciate your insights. Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the split services. I just had some concerns, and hopefully maybe I can get my questions answered. I'm just curious about the capacity for RTD. If you're splitting services, it sounds like you're going to need more drivers, and maybe you guys can correct me on that. The lack of drivers, and then I can just see a scenario where I get on a bus that's split. I take the first leg, and then I find out the second leg is not there because the route was dropped because we didn't have enough drivers. So I noticed that it was said that most of these are going to go to train stations or hubs. But I'm just curious how many, if you guys can identify, and obviously you may not have that number today, but identify how many routes don't drop off at a train station. So those are my concerns on the split service.
Okay, yeah, I know numbers on how many we split to improve that reliability, but I don't have the going to the train service. So I'll look into that and see what I can find for you. Let's see, Danny, I think I see a hand.
Yep, thanks. So So Danny, with CoPERD, statewide advocacy group, I want to first just say really excited to see you're attempting to get a flatter service profile. I think that seems really important from everything I've heard from the people who work and run these routes. So I think that's important, and also just to help create consistency for riders, so they're not constantly asking themselves, all right, is it 3 o'clock? Is it 4 o'clock? What's the changes in the routes? So I think that's really helpful. To your point, Holly, that you made a little bit ago, I remember one of our first meetings that we had, it was very stark when we were presented with, if we want geographic ridership, if we want to get ridership everywhere, that's the one. If we want to get routes everywhere, that's the one that has the lowest ridership. And if we want to maximize ridership or get into some of the transit dependent communities or whatnot, there was a lot of overlap there. I look at this map and it looks an awful lot like what the data and numbers were telling us, which, to then everyone else's point, isn't enough. And I feel like this is great for me, because this tells me on our current trajectory, this is what we will have by 2027 and as a transit system. And I think that's unacceptable. And I'm excited to use this map to then make the case that we're going to need significantly more dollars if we're going to actually have the transit system that we want. And I think part of the point of this Reimagine process is exactly all the comments that keep coming in of like, we need to reimagine this. We need transit here, and we need this here, and we need that here. But I think from my just very basic look at this, it does seem like you've done what the data was telling you to do, which is if you want to maximize ridership with limited dollars, this is where you need to put it. It's not good enough for the whole region. So we need to now step up and figure out how to expand the funding so that we can get to where we need to go, because this is certainly not the transit system that's going to solve climate change or is going to provide affordability or access to the whole Denver metro region by 2027. And even that number is kind of far out there. So I definitely support the concerns and frustrations that people are presenting. But I do think with limited dollars, this is kind of what everything I've seen so far was telling you to do. And really the thing we need to start talking about in earnest is how do we get more money?
That's a great perspective, Danny. I really appreciate that. Julie, I see there's a fair bit in the chat. Have you had an eye on it? Is there anything that needs to be answered perhaps by Doug or myself?
A lot of it is supportive and thumbs up for different people's comments, which is excellent.
Okay.
Thank you guys for doing that. It gives us a sense. We had a couple of questions from Joel around the family of service categories, around defining core, clarifying, is it core? It is at least 15-minute service for the full 18-hour span, or is that just in peak and midday? So that was one of the questions.
Doug, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, so the 15-minute service on core is only in the peak and midday service. So from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., those routes will all have at least 15-minute service, and with service adjusted in the early and late periods to match demand. Probably, some routes will still be at 15 minutes, but others will probably drop down to a half hour in those later periods.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then there's still just continued comments about wanting or desiring additional or needing additional service in particular geographic areas as well.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you so much, everybody. That was great insights. And we'll have some items to get back to you on as well. So appreciate that. Let's see. I think we are going to, Katie, are we going to share the tool now?
Did we want to go over the
yes,
stakeholder input?
please do. Thank you. Thank you, Doug.
Okay. Yeah. So we did start sharing this towards the end of November, first with the RTD board, and then in mid-December we shared it with the 5 service sectors that we've identified through this process. So that's the Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest, and the Boulder County service sectors. Just some of the comments from that are shared here, but I think the big the big thing that we heard from everybody was we need to see what we hear from the public when we when we release this in draft form. So Holly's going to jump into a little bit about how this is being shared with the public and how we can get the input of the public on this proposal.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now and step you through, let's see here, and step you through the tool that we've put together for soliciting input. And we went over this with the technical working group yesterday and got some great feedback that we're actively working on. So I'll just tell you, we're working on it, but it's not up and live, so I can just give you some updates on what it is. So when we get to, from our RTD website, we click on a share your ideas. You click here to provide feedback. And it pops you into this tool and splash screen that allow you to comment on the route specific recommendations that are included in the SOP. Now, the first thing to be aware of is that our commenters yesterday on the technical working group asked us to provide some Spanish translation information in here. So we have that ready, and it's being updated right now. So you can't see it just yet, but it's coming live hopefully later today. So this provides you a bit of information. The splash screen provides you a bit of information on what the SOP is, why it was conducted, and then it provides information on how to leave a comment as well. So then we enter the site. And right away, you can see, actually, even from yesterday, we have a lot of new comments. So you are able to, the yellow dots represent the comments that we have received. You can click on the yellow dot and see what the person has said. So in this case, somebody wrote, seems like the LD1 jog into downtown Lafayette and then around Exempla campus takes a lot of time. Why not keep the bus on 287? So, and you can see we have comments throughout the area, which is very exciting. I'm happy to see it working. So let's talk quickly about, and I'm hoping you all can help spread the word about how you comment on the tool, because it's an Esri GIS based tool. It's quite powerful, but it also is not as easy as just getting online and sending an email. So you're going to go over here to add comment. Let's see here. You click on RTD public comments, and then you just select wherever the location you'd like to comment. Like we'd like to, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. We'd like to comment that we'd like more service on the west end of the metro area. I'm going to put test there because this is just a test. So now we've added a comment over on the west end of our community. You are able to as well, let's go into the layers. You can turn off, say you don't want to look at all the routes included, but you want to look at, say, the core bus routes. You're particularly interested in what that core looks like. You can click the core on and the core rail routes on. Somebody asked about what the red lines are here. They're blue. All the core routes are blue. You can add the connect services over the top so you can see what services are considered connect and how they connect into the area. So again, you can just put those on and off so that you can and zoom into them if you like. You can also look at the routes as they, so this is mislabeled here. It's called 2019 core routes. It's actually 2019. It's the entire system. So you can click on the whole system and see the changes from the 2019 service to the SOP service. So you can start to see where there are some changes that if you are a rider, you're going to be particularly impacted, if you were connecting in that service. So those are areas of interest as well to provide some context of the change. Now it's not from 2020 because that is lower than what we have in 2027. Another opportunity is, say you're interested in a particular route. So you can go up into this enter route number up here. For this, we'll just say 0. And we're going to say, yes, we're interested in the 0. So it's going to zoom to the route 0. Now, maybe you typed in a 0, but you were actually interested in the 120. You can select that down here. And you're interested in what the specific recommendations are for the SOP. So I can see the route on the map is highlighted. I can see that it's the route named 0, and I can just click on this PDF and it will open up the very specific recommendations for the Route 0. So you can see what happened to the Route 0, the current service plan, and that it's part of the core network. Let's see if there's anything else that would be, oopsie, sorry, I'm clicking around here. Let's get out of that. I see a hand, Danny.
Yeah, just curious if, I assume a lot of people will have similar reactions to, a lot of people who are commenting from the public will have similar reactions to what you heard today, which is, well, I would like to see additional things here, here, and here.
Yep.
Can you make sure that you're capturing all those comments so we can use those to then inform the, so this is what we got, but what we really want is, so that we don't have to do a second survey with people? Because I do worry a lot of people get asked to do tell us what you think surveys and then don't see where it goes all the time.
Yeah.
So if we could just do both and then maybe produce some report at the end of however many weeks or months this is going to be open, you could go, you know, thanks for your system optimization plan feedback. Here's some changes we're going to make. In addition, we got all this other, you know, feedback, and here are some things we're hearing loud and clear that need to be on the, like, we need new money for, you know, plan or whatever, just so we don't have to do it a second time.
Yeah, yeah. So you are able to, you know, if you have an area that you want, kind of like I demonstrated over here, you can provide a comment that's in an area where you don't have service. So we can capture that. Though I will say it doesn't specifically say comment where you'd like service, you know, like that's not called out explicitly. So if you have an idea about how to make that more obvious, that I would like to hear that. But I'll have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, not off the top of my head, but it'd be great to encourage that as well, since, you know, 2 birds with 1 stone would be great.
Yep, agreed. Dea?
Hi, yes. I am a little concerned just about the accessibility and language accessibility of the tool. So I'm wondering if you could speak to what you all might be doing to make this a little bit more accessible in diverse languages other than English.
Yep. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So I mentioned on the splash screen, we will be adding a contact us for more information in Spanish. We'll be adding to the tool a title in Spanish, and then we'll be doing some, there's this piece out here too. Let me show you this as well. This piece will be translated into Spanish, and we'll have an email location that people can get a native Spanish speaker that they can speak to directly from that email address as well. So I think we've done, and that was a lot based on comments we got yesterday. So I absolutely appreciate you bringing those up today. And then accessibility from, you know, someone who's visually impaired. This document is organized to be read aloud, as well as this tool up here can also be clicked and accessed, which is it's a PowerPoint of every single slide and recommendation that was made. It's not perfect, but it does provide some pretty good information there. So it's better. It's not ideal, but it's better. Does that help, Dea?
It does. I guess I'm just curious of other languages as well. And then, you know, I guess a concern that I have is that the tool itself might be kind of difficult to navigate. So will there be any sort of explainer videos or something that will support folks?
Yeah, I hadn't, we don't have a video planned, but I love that idea. I'll see what we can, what we might be able to do. And at this point, we don't have a path for any other languages, but Julie, if you have thoughts on that, I would welcome that.
Absolutely. We'll put some thought into that. Thank you for that comment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Bill. So I'll just say, I think we can work with our transit equity group on having access to other translation services outside of Spanish, because I know that we do have that ability to do that. So we will work with our transit equity group on that.
Great. I don't think I'm seeing any other hands. Any other questions or thoughts or suggestions for us? What about in the chat, Julie? Anything there?
Let's see, some of the similar questions that we've had about accessibility, and then discussion from Director Williams about putting out more information around public outreach after this meeting.
Okay, perfect. And I see we have seniors aren't computer literate. Well, now that some of them are, but I agree that we will have just an email address that will be available to people as well. And Julie, I'm not sure about a phone number. Is there a phone number provided?
I will double check. If not,
Okay.
we can certainly add one.
Okay. All right. That's all I have. And we would love it if you'd get on here and provide comments, and any other ideas you have on making sure it's just as useful to the public as possible is very much appreciated. Okay, Julie, next steps.
We do have a quick question. Commissioner Maurer looks like just popped in.
Hi, how long are you going to be taking comments?
Excellent point. Transition right into this next slide. Thank you so much. So public comment will be accepted until February 9th.
Thank you.
So we had actually extended that a week based on some feedback that we've received. So kind of big picture, we're talking with you guys today. We've been holding a series of service sector meetings late last year, as well as some listening sessions this year, again, to just gather feedback into this. And then we're going to be continuing to provide regular updates to the board of directors, including the feedback that we are hearing all the way along, making sure that we are sharing that with them. And public comment on this tool will be open until February 9th. Then early February, we're actually going to do a series of focus groups, customer panels on the customer side, just get a little bit more feedback, all rolling together to finalize the SOP in the February timeframe so that it can go early March to the RTD board for final approval or final discussion and approval. So that's our schedule with the SOP. Let me know if you have any questions on that.
Okay. Tammy, I see a hand? Oh, no, you took it down. Okay. And then there is, Julie, just support for a phone number in the chat.
Thank you.
About that. Okay, so we're going to move now into the mobility plan for the future, and we've got some really, I think, interesting updates for you here. Just as for those of you, I know there's some new people to the group. We've been in parallel with working on the system optimization plan. The Reimagine RTD has another component, which is the mobility plan for the future. So the system optimization plan is really trying to, maximize and optimize every dollar spent by RTD in the more near term. So it's, the next 5 years-ish. How do we really just get every dollar we can out of the limited resources available? So that's the system optimization plan. The mobility plan for the future puts a longer range hat on. And we look to figure out what RTD's role in mobility in our metropolitan area is in the longer term as we think more out to, say, 2050. How do we position RTD to make sure that they're still relevant, that they're providing services that people are interested in using, and that they're helping the community meet our quality goals and just the changing mobility needs that we're seeing even through the COVID timeframe. So with that, we started with a set of guiding principles that you'll see in the circle on the left. We moved into having customer come first. This is really the public engagement piece. So we've been having public engagement and asking people throughout the process what they think RTD's role is. On the top in the blue line, we look at that market and travel demand analysis for the future. And this is again, to some of the points made earlier in the system optimization plan where a lot of growth is occurring. This is where we get to take a really close look at where growth is occurring, how it compares to what's on the ground today, and try and make sure that services are provided in all of the areas that have the potential to support transit service. Then on the bottom in the lighter blue line, we look at strategies to serve that future travel market and demand. At the last couple of meetings, we've talked about recommendations that the team has made around workforce. And you saw some of those today, even on the SOP. We're trying to implement having fewer split shifts helps with some of the issues that the workforce is having. And then we have some longer range recommendations as well. Last time we were together, we looked at the district boundary. What does it look like from a financial and service perspective if RTD expands its district? What does it look like if it contracts its district? We've been talking about the opportunities for fleet electrification and what that means for the bus and rail maintenance facilities. We also talked about first and last mile. So how do we get to those transit hubs other than driving our cars? Are there some opportunities to improve some of the flex rides, mobility on demand, make sure that we have sidewalks, for heaven's sakes, so that people can access them? And then today we're going to have an opportunity to dig into, we haven't yet had an opportunity to talk about parking and how parking might be impacted. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, last time we talked about mobility as a service as well. We also, a part of this is also understanding the financial picture for RTD. So we have been spending quite a bit of time looking at what the future holds for RTD from a financial perspective. Today, our partners from EPS, Economic Planning Systems, join us. They're going to help us understand how Tabor impacts RTD's finances. I think that'll be great. And then, of course, all of this wraps up and results in the mobility plan for the future, both a fiscally constrained plan and a needs-based plan. So, you know, as Danny was speaking to, we have needs beyond what we can afford today in our region. So let's start talking about how we can make sure our finances are, one, used the best they can be used, and how we expand that pot as well. So with that, Rachel, if you are out there, I'd love for you to take over and give us some information on your Tabor analysis.
Thanks, Holly. So as Holly mentioned, I'm Rachel Shinman with Economic and Planning Systems, and Dan Guimond is on the call as well. And we're going to walk through a revenue analysis that we did to understand the potential impacts of Tabor on RTD's revenue. So Tabor, as most of us probably know, is the Taxpayer's Bill of Rights. The most common piece of it that people are aware of is the requirement of voter approval for new taxes or tax increases or debt issuances. The piece of it that we're looking at in this analysis is another component, which is a revenue limit on what governments and other agencies that collect tax revenue can retain and spend, and the requirement that excess revenue is refunded to the taxpayers. And so the framework of this analysis is the potential of debrucing, which is opting out of this revenue limit, which requires a vote of the electorate. And as we can see on this slide, it's a pretty common strategy taken by a lot of municipalities in the state. So we can see that the vast majority of counties, municipalities, and school districts the voters in those communities have all voted to debruce. Now on the next slide, we see why we're talking about this with RTD. So currently RTD's two sales tax revenue sources, the 0.6% base system tax and the 0.4% fast track tax, are not subject to Tabor. But as we can see, in 2024, the base system exemption expires when the T-Rex bonds are paid off. So what we're looking to do is to understand what the impacts of being subject to the Tabor revenue limits would be on this 0.6% sales and use tax collection. So the next slide just outlines the key questions that we're looking at. So what will the revenue limits, what impact will that have on revenue collection? And then how might some of these findings inform considerations of a potential election to debruce? So what we're looking at, there's two components that we're looking to compare. So these are both within the district geography. So there's, on the right side, the revenue that RTD collects within the district. And so that's like I said, the 0.6% sales and use tax collection. And then on the left side is the comparison factor, which is outlined in Tabor, which is the local growth. And so there's two components of that. There's inflation and then the actual growth in the local area, which is the increase in the value of taxable property. And so as Tabor outlines in that blue box, if the revenue from non-excluded sources exceeds the local growth, then that excess has to be refunded. And so that's the basis of this analysis. So we're going to walk through a simple example before we get into all the big numbers. So again, we have these two components, the local growth and the agency revenue. So in this example, let's say inflation for the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood area, which is our subject area, there was a 1% increase, and this is year over year. And then there was a 3% increase in the value of taxable property. That means that our overall local growth, our comparison factor, is 4%. So this is the maximum amount of change that we can see in sales and use tax revenue. Then on the other side is what we need to look at on the revenue side. So let's say we have two examples. On the top, let's say in this same year, there was a 5% increase in sales and use tax revenue. Because that 5% is higher than the 4% of local growth, we would need to refund the excess. On the flip side, in example E, or our second example, if there was only a 3% increase in sales and use tax revenue, we're fine, we're golden, no refunds are necessary. So this is the framework of the analysis. So what we did is we looked back, because we have the data, we don't need to try and predict the future. So we looked from 2007 through 2019. Those were years we had consistent data, and we accounted for multiple economic cycles, because that's really the key driver of this, is when sales and use tax revenue and property tax or property value increases are offset or are increasing at different rates. So we have three key data inputs outlined on this slide. Inflation, like I said, is the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood CPI. It comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's laid out in Tabor. Then local growth is the year over year change in property values. And while Tabor calls out actual values, for data accessibility, we used assessed values as a proxy for this, because we can get those from all the county assessors. And so what we did, instead of trying to slice and dice the actual district boundaries, because this is a high level analysis trying to help us understand what the overall impact would have been, we took the full counties for all of the counties that make up the district. We excluded Wells just because it's such a small portion of the county is within the district. We didn't want that data to throw it off. And then the district revenues, we got actual sales and use tax collections from 2007 through to 2019. And so again, this key question is, how would Tabor limits, right now that 0.6% is not subject to Tabor because the revenue is paying off the T-Rex bonds. But if RTD had been subject to Tabor over this 12-year time period, what would the impact have been? So the first step in this is to identify which years RTD would have had to refund revenue. So again, that's where the year over year increase in sales and use tax collection is higher than the combined increase of inflation and local property value. So we can see at the top, we have this property valuation, and then we have the CPI. And so those added together are that bottom section of the inflation plus local growth. And we can see in the years where the increase in revenue collection is lower than the increase in local growth, we get a green value, we're good to go, no refunds necessary. In years where the increase in revenue is higher, then we have a refund year. And so what we see is that overall, over this 12-year time period, on the next slide, there would have been 4 years that RTD would have had to refund revenue. So then the next stage is to calculate the refunds and what that would have meant for revenue generation. So what we have to do is we have to adjust the revenue down to match the local growth. And so in this example, in 2011, because revenue was higher than local growth, RTD would have actually had to refund almost 13% of the revenue collected. And then that forms the basis for the next year. And so we can see this cumulative impact of these refunds. And so while that lower sales and use tax revenue is still grown at the rate that's seen, we're growing from a lower base. And so on the next slide, we see this played out over these 12 years, over these 4 refund years. And we see the cumulative impact of these refunds. And so what this would have meant over this time period, on the next slide, we see the comparison. So RTD actually saw an average annual growth of 3.86% in the sales and use tax collections from 2007 to 2019. If the agency had been subject to Tabor over this time period, sales and use tax revenue would have grown at an average annual rate of 1.4%. So over this time period, this would have resulted in almost $645 million in refunded revenue, which is almost 17% of the total revenue collected over this time period. And so again, this is a backwards looking analysis to help us understand what the potential impacts are. This isn't what actually happened because the agency is currently not subject to the revenue limits, but 2024 is that switch point when once the TREX bonds are paid off, there is that consideration of, do we move forward under the current regulations, or do we try to move forward with an election to debruce and not be subject to these limits?
That's great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Let's open it up to questions. I do see some in the chat. Rachel, I think that Tabor only applies in RTD's case. Obviously, they have revenue that comes from a bunch of different sources. Tabor only applies to the sales and use tax. Is that right? I mean, they have lots of other revenue sources that come in, but is that correct?
My understanding is it's only tax revenue, and Dan can probably jump in on this one also.
Yeah, that is correct. I saw a chat question about fare box revenues, grant revenues. Those are not subject to these limitations. The other thing that was on the slide, on the early slide, that what we didn't mention necessarily is that the 0.4% portion of the RTD sales tax that funds the Fast Tracks program is exempt from Tabor limitations until 2039, until the Fast Tracks bonds are paid off.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I see a hand up from Danny, and then we have a couple things in the chat. Danny, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just real quick, when you say 2024, do you mean starting January or July or November? Kind of what's the date by which money would have to start being, counted for the refund?
I believe, correct me if you know, Holly, I believe it's through 2024. And so the following year would be subject to Tabor.
Okay, we can double check on it.
So
we can double check that.
So a fix needs to be in place by December of 2023, or you could conceivably fix it in 2024 and avoid it, in 2025. I guess that'd be it's more of a political question, like when would voters need to vote to fix this?
That's a good question, or an excellent question. There's sort of the technical side of this, and there's the political side of this. RTD could choose, for instance, to go to a Tabor election to debruce in 2023 to avoid that impact, or if for logistical or political reasons they wanted to wait until 2024 or 2026, the election could be held then. It's just that in that interim time period, they would be subject to Tabor. But it's not, it doesn't prohibit RTD from doing a Tabor election at a later date.
Thanks.
In the chat, Rachel and Dan, they do talk about, which may impact like the timing in 2024 timeframe. They talk about, but since the pandemic, property values have gone up insanely. So in that case, then we'd see a big growth, and you'd probably, I guess, if I am thinking about that right, then you'd be able to retain more, I think, is that. And then there's another one that said, are you able to project what would happen with a big decline, then sizable increase as seen in the pandemic?
Right. So a couple things. One, this analysis was done partially based on full data availability. So we took the
Okay,
years where we
sounds
had
good.
all of the data. And then
Okay,
also,
sounds good.
Hey, I'm sorry
Thanks.
to interrupt, Rachel. Katie, can you mute people that aren't talking for me? Okay, sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah. So we looked at the full set of years where we had data, and because we were looking at the cumulative impact of this, so it's less about individual years change. And that's why we took this time period where we had these multiple economic cycles. So that's sort of what we're in right now also, is, you know, some of the ups and downs that we would see. And so looking at the overall cumulative impact of that, because this isn't, you know, a 2-year or a 5-year issue to consider. It really is, you know, over 30 years, what would happen. But I mean, it's a great point that we are, you know, within one of these cycles right now.
And I think if you look at the historical analysis that Rachel showed, one of the first years where the biggest impact was felt was during the Great Recession, where I believe property taxes dropped by what, 12 or 13% in that one year, and had a major impact at that point in time.
Yeah, the valuation dropped over 12%. And then there are other years where it, you know, increased a whole lot. And, you know, the revaluation and all of these things impact that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is the, you know, the interesting piece of it is that, you know, you have these downturns during a recession, but at that same time, you're resetting the base lower. So when the recovery takes place, you're not getting the full benefit of the recovery because you're basically starting from a lower base rate. And that's why over that 12-year period, you get such a cumulative impact of this revenue limitation.
Okay, great, thank you. Commissioner Levy?
Oh, thanks. So one of my questions was answered, but just to flag, I'm very rusty on Tabor right now, but I'm not sure whether actually you look at calendar year or fiscal year revenues for calculating this. It's complicated, and you look back, I know, 1 year and then have to refund it in a future year. So I think it's worth looking at that issue of calendar year versus fiscal year. And I think the political discussion is really a pretty urgent discussion because if RTD is going to go towards debrucing, starting to line up that conversation is going to be really, really important.
And that's a great point. The amendment does call out fiscal year spending. You know, again, for this analysis, we're trying to keep it high level and match data to data just to make sure that we were comparing apples to apples. But once we get into the more detailed political and logistical conversations, it's definitely critical to really understand all those intricacies.
Councillor Flynn?
Thank you. I remember when the fast tracks vote was held, being very curious exactly how that 0.4% would be adjusted when the time came that the bonds were paid off. I'm going to go back to that slide, slide 17 on my copy of the PDF. Have we figured out the mechanism for determining exactly how much or even whether the 0.4% sales and use tax would be reduced to maintain funding for ongoing O&M of just the fast tracks elements? I mean, what are the components of that calculation? And second part of the question, would the authorization in 2004 allow for that rate to fluctuate at all when O&M costs fluctuate themselves over the course of time? Obviously, over the remaining existence of the fast tracks service, O&M is going to vary probably pretty wildly. Or would it just go down, if at all, to a fixed amount forever under Tabor, unless changed by the voters?
Well, I don't know that I can fully answer your question. I do know that the sales tax allocated to the fast tracks bonds is for capital and not and some amount for O&M, but I don't believe there's any ability to adjust the rates for the increasing amount of O&M over the period of the bonds.
Mhm. Okay, do we know yet what what are the components of the calculation for O&M after the bonds are paid off? In other words, will the 0.4% fast tracks levy actually be reduced?
I probably defer that question to Bill or Brian. My
Yeah, and
understanding
we
is the
have
tax goes away unless it's reauthorized, but
And we have Alyssa on the line with WSP, who's the other, working on the other piece of the financial analysis, but we may need to get back to you just to make sure we don't misspeak on that. We'll do that.
Okay, obviously, you know, the answer to that question is going to have an impact on the ability to maintain service on that part of the system.
Yep,
Sure.
absolutely. Okay, any other comments or questions at this time? Okay, let's move into the next piece, which is, thank you, Rachel and Dan. That was really helpful and very informative. Let's weave into, we've got Christina with Walker Parking who's joining us, and they have made a few recommendations that they'd like to run past this group around parking and the future of parking within RTD.
Thank you, Holly. So just a high level overview of the recommendations. I do want to start by pointing out that all of our recommendations are developed around the Reimagine RTD guiding principles. With that, our first recommendation is to implement paid parking using demand-based fees. This would be at 3 rates, if you will, for in and out of district parkers. You would have the higher utilization facilities at 1 rate, the lower utilization facilities at another, and then your lowest utilizations would be free. So with that, we would look to integrate that payment into the transit payment platform so that it was one transaction or more conveniently completed for those who are using the parking facilities. We're also recommending expanding the reserved parking opportunities, specifically the leasing opportunities that are available to those who utilize the parking at RTD stations. This would be a tiered opportunity for those who are interested in the lease parking. Again, you could have covered parking, uncovered areas that are reserved up until a certain point of the day, very similar to what is offered today, just with a few more options so that individuals can choose the option that's best for their needs. And then looking at monetizing the existing parking assets. This includes not only expanding on sponsorship opportunities, but potentially converting some of the existing parking facilities, whether that's right-sizing those to reduce the amount of unutilized parking and serve more of a mobility hub purpose at those locations, or selling off entire or partial parking supplies where those are not needed.
All right. That was a pretty high level overview. Danny, I see a hand.
Yeah, you specifically call out car and van pooling in the reserve parking. Are you considering car share programs? I know we've started to see a lot more of the Colorado car share program. Seems like a great hub for those.
Absolutely. Car share, carpool, van pool, those would all be signed specific to those branded vehicles to make enforcement easier, of course.
Excellent, thanks.
Anyone else with a question? Oh, there's something in the chat about back in 2018, parking that would, how much parking could generate at $1 a day. Yeah, it's actually a pretty substantial amount of money that could be generated.
Yes, at the rates that we've recommended, we are projecting potential revenues up to 12.9 million a year.
That's great. Thanks, Christina. Commissioner Levy?
Thanks. So I appreciate the need to charge for parking for the equity reasons and, and the revenue reasons. The one thing I'm struggling with here, honestly, is that RTD fares are really expensive. And, there's supposed to be the fare study going on. And I do worry that, that the additional charge for parking could be that, that choke point that drives somebody back into their car. And so I think while I'm supportive of this for a lot of policy reasons, just the practical, wallet motivations that people have really, I think, require RTD to get that fare study done and bring its fares just more in line with what other transit agencies charge.
Absolutely.
We received a similar comment yesterday that was around, which I thought was really terrific. It was around making sure that you're bringing those together. You're talking about the fare study and you're talking about the parking charging together as one unit. And the suggestion was made, okay, charge for parking, but reduce the fare so that you are getting the money where it, where you're needing to, which I thought was an interesting point. But to your point, yeah, you have to think about the whole package and making sure that we're not just now encouraging everybody to drive because it costs so much end to end to service.
And I'm not just thinking of lower income people. I'm really thinking of, again, your discretionary riders who, just don't want to bother.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep,
and the rates that we've been looking at are far below market rates. I do want to include that. And we are including some subsidy opportunities for equity populations, very much in line with the discounts that RTD offers today, extending those into the paid parking program, in addition to the transit fares.
Mr. Soroy?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to say that, one, to respond to Commissioner Levy's comments, one about the fare study, and we're kicking that off as we speak. We've got a consultant on board and we are kind of ramping up, and you can expect to hear some opportunities for engagement here in the near future. But just wanted to kind of make sure that we are moving forward with that. I know there hasn't been a lot of information out, but that will be ramping up very quickly. But just in response, just generally on parking, we understand that charging is a very sensitive issue. I know our board has struggled with it a little bit over several years that it's come up. But so I think that, looking at these recommendations, these are going to be, this is not going to be something that we're going to look to implement next week. It's going to be something that's going to be take under consideration, look at the results of the fare study and kind of look at them together, I think. So I think you can rest assured that we're not going to be moving forward with something on charging for parking absent kind of understanding the results of the fare study and moving forward with that.
Good, thank you. Christina, there was a comment as well from Dea from the Accountability Committee, and she talks about reviewing fare evasion and ensuring it's equitable compared to the fine associated with parking. You did in your longer notes, you had talked about enforcement, but I don't know that it was tied to it being equitable. But I don't know that there's a response needed. I just want you to be aware of that so that we can take that into account as we finalize the recommendations.
Absolutely, thank you.
Mike?
Yeah, so on the paid parking, there's a couple of problems that I see. If we start going to a paid parking, there's communities already around parking structures that RTD have that struggle with people parking in the neighborhoods and congestion. How does that affect the communities around the parking rights?
So one of the issues that we're also seeing with having free parking accessible at many stations is we're seeing a lot of individuals park at park and rides who are not using transit services. So we're having overflow in both directions. Again, I would like to point out that the fares that we are recommending are far below market value. So there are, it is a lower cost option than many parking facilities in the neighborhoods surrounding these facilities. Where that overflow or that high utilization is incurring in those areas is generally due to a lack of supply for those demand generators surrounding the area. There's just a lot of congestion in general. Will this contribute to that? Possibly. That is something that we are considering, and your comment is definitely noted.
You know, one
I should
thing we
also
might
add that if RTV were to move forward with a paid parking strategy in the future at some point, RTV and the immediate adjacent agencies in which their stations and parking facilities are located would need to work together cooperatively to make sure that we don't have those concerns about spillover parking and them impacting the communities negatively.
Bill?
Andrew took my comment. I was just going to say the same thing, that we do need to partner with local jurisdictions where we do have those park and rides and work with them about enforcement issues and, you know, potentially, you know, the hide and ride kind of concept. So definitely we would need to work with local jurisdictions on that.
Oh, are you about to? Oh, I'm so sorry. Counselor Marvin?
Thanks. So yeah, so some concerns with this. I mean, especially about the people parking in the neighborhoods because they don't want to pay for parking. You know, I mean, again, you know, in the suburbs, they'll just go park on the neighborhood streets. Like there isn't, you know, it's not like there's another facility, you know, nearby. They'll just go park in the neighborhoods, and there's not, you know, anything to stop them from doing that. So I'm just concerned about the congestion there and everything. And then I think the other part too is, again, because we don't have a lot of, you know, connecting routes and everything up here, people are having to, like in the suburbs, people are having to drive to get to the park and rides and parking. And so, you know, to be charging them, you know, again, like some other people are saying, you know, we have the higher fares, and then to also charge them for parking. I just have a lot of concerns that it's really gonna, it's gonna impact ridership too, because if you can, you know, if you're having to drive anyways to get to the park and ride to take the bus, why would you not? You know, and then now you're having to pay for parking. It's just going to disincentivize people. But like I said, I think especially in the suburbs, when we don't have opportunities for connecting routes to, you know, you can walk from your house, catch a bus, and then get to the park and ride. You know, there's not options besides driving, and then making people pay to park just seems like it's going to impact ridership.
Okay, good. Thank you.
In the chat, Andrea, the major problems at Kiss and Rides, can you expand on what your thoughts are there?
Sure. The Bellevue and Orchard stations are Kiss and Rides, and the parking people on the streets outside of those 30 spots that are at the station is insane. Even though there's not much of a neighborhood around either of those stations, there are neighborhoods growing, especially around Bellevue, where there's dozens of cars just parked along the streets because there's no place at the Kiss and Ride.
Gotcha. So just to ensure that I'm hearing you correctly, you're referring to the spillover from those facilities.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
There's another comment from Director Williams. Are most people parking to ride the train? And if so, what is the national standard free parking at train stations?
I can't say that we have the data for origin destination of those who are parking at the facilities, where they go once they park. In terms of best practices nationally, they are moving towards paid parking at Park and Rides. That is to not only distribute demands more efficiently across the Park and Ride system, because as we have acknowledged, some are better utilized than others. But it's also to provide funding sources for the operations and ongoing maintenance of those facilities, your snow removal, your line striping. Those all have costs, and we're looking to use paid parking as a way to have that funded by those who are directly benefited from it, rather than all transit riders who may not be utilizing the parking.
Super helpful, thank you.
Kate, on your comment of the train versus bus routes, that was part of our analysis. We do see a pattern of parking utilization related to the station type. So that is something that we have looked into and are considering as we are presenting some of these rates for consideration.
Thank you.
I think I don't see any other hands up. So Christina, thank you so much for the information, and we'll look forward to seeing some of those recommendations. Next, we're going to dip back into the zero emission vehicle work that's been being conducted. For those of you that are new to the group today, we have over the last several meetings had updates on the methodology around creating and understanding how electric buses may be incorporated into RTD's facility, and if that, giving RTD information about what that could look like if they decide to go down that path. And also what influence that has on their facilities, because obviously we need a place to maintain and charge those buses if RTD chooses that route. So there are some recommendations, and Katie's going to give us some just very high level overview of next steps there.
Thanks, Holly. Good morning, everybody. So as Holly mentioned, this has kind of we've been giving brief updates along the way about kind of the facilities and for rail and maintenance, as well as kind of how that impacts the potential transition to zero emission vehicles. Our friends from WSP, I know there's a couple of them out on the call today, have been working really hard behind the scenes to kind of pull all of these elements together. As Holly mentioned, one of the first things that was done was the development of a model to really understand how are we going to model the potential transition to battery electric bus across the RTD system, and what are those parameters and assumptions that go into that. So that was one of the first steps. And then also our partners from WSP came out and did in-person facility site visits, because there's a lot of implications on the facilities related to what we need to do in terms of charging infrastructure, housing the vehicles, if you have to have a replacement of a vehicle, if you have a 1.2 or a 2 vehicle replacement need for battery electric bus to what your diesel vehicles are today, you have a lot of implications on your facilities. So before I dive into some of the recommendations, there are a number of reports and things that are in RTD staff's hands right now. So one is the actual facility analysis for the battery electric bus transition. So breaking down every bus facility that RTD either operates, owns, or contracts with a contractor with, what does that look like? How are those vehicles going to be housed? How do they circulate? What are all of the utility needs? How does that actually look? So that is one element that's underway. The other component, which is more kind of just overarching growth of the system and facility need that would then integrate with potential transition to battery electric bus, is if RTD needed a new facility to support future demand and growth into the 2050 horizon, what does that look like in terms of, if you need a 250 bus facility or a 500 bus facility? So kind of looking at those new kind of greenfield elements that you could develop into those space programs. The other piece that they are reviewing is the rail facilities and conditions report. So both for the light rail and the commuter rail. So that's another element And then the kind of culmination of all of this, which is going to bring all these pieces together, is kind of that fleet and facility phasing approach. So taking all of these pieces together, all the data, all the information, all of the potential phasing of the fleet, how do you actually package that together, and what would that look like in terms of an actual kind of implementation phasing plan? So circling back, so that's kind of the status report, but circling back to kind of some of the initial outcomes of the battery electric bus preliminary recommendations. There is this scope of work really focuses on the BEV, on the battery electric bus, and not looking at a lot of other alternative fuels. There is, of course, consideration, but we all know that there are new things coming online, and is electrification indeed the right answer in the near term, midterm, long term? So definitely need to be looking at what some of those other opportunities might be in terms of hydrogen, and how that could support the future of RTD's growth and expansion. The other piece is, our kind of the intention of this analysis and kind of looking at the battery electric bus transition is kind of, should RTD decide to go down this road, what does that look like? So a key next step would be to determine, is there short term, some recommendations that make sense, or in the near term, as you're looking at different alternative fuels, and what does that transition actually look like? Of course, there's the grant funding availability with the new infrastructure bill. There's a lot of additional funding available under the bus and bus facilities, as well as the low and no grant program as well. So there will be opportunity, and how is that leveraged? So there's a lot of pieces kind of that are all kind of percolating together, and that will come together into these recommendations. But there are some key next steps in terms of how RTD decides to kind of take this information and utilize it, and moving and navigating its path forward. So I would say that's kind of the overall, kind of not detailed, but more of an update status today. And we asked the technical working group yesterday if there was any interest in having a subgroup to really get into the nitty-gritty details about kind of the battery electric bus transition and the zero emission future. And there was limited interest, but I would definitely wanted to open it up to this group too. And maybe we'll have Julie do again, if you want to throw out into the chat about if there is interest, we could do, a small working group. We could provide, reports and information, and have follow-up discussions. So if you are interested in participating in that, just go ahead and chat, send a yes in the chat box, and we will go from there. So with that, I think that's the update. And if there's any questions, we can entertain those.
I don't see any hands up. Danny says, oh, there's a hand. Danny says he'd like to be part of that. Mike.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed that's really lacking in all this zero emissions bus programs is workforce. Nobody's doing any training for workforce on how to work on the buses, how that changes with repairs, as far as towing the buses back to the locations. And I think the conferences that I've been a part of show a big expansion as far as facilities. And I just don't know where RTD plans on expanding, because I know the Boulder division is at its limits. The Longmont division is at its limits. I just don't know how much of that is going to have to expand with the zero emissions bus program. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And that is absolutely a huge component of this. So this facility analysis that was done for this project, for the battery electric bus transition, goes into immense detail of all of the sites, exactly where those buses would be housed, and identifies where there's, issues and opportunities. So I would definitely encourage you, if you are interested, we could get into some of those nuts and bolts with you. In terms of the training and kind of getting people on board and in the maintenance realm, I think there is, as you said, there's a lot of things nationally that are coming down the pike that we need to be more on the nose with this, and how do we get people trained up? How do we get the workforce ready? I know Kate Kelly's on the line, and we just worked on a zero emission plan for transit in the state of Colorado. And, you know, one of the big things there is what can we do as a state to kind of start this workforce training and getting things moved along so that we can get people on board and have the workforce we need to support this transition. So I totally agree with you that it is something that is important and needs to be a part of the considerations.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Katie, and thanks to the group for those that input. Julie, I think you are here on the public engagement and next steps. And I did want to just chime back in as we think about, Julie's going to, you know, go back around on providing input on the SOP, going back to sort of the first part of the meeting. One of the things I have asked the technical working group, and when we met with the service sectors, is that when we put recommendations out as for service, new service or extensions of service, what would be incredibly helpful is trying to help us think through where those dollars and service hours might come from, you know, to help us remain in that fiscally constrained and fiscally sustainable place for the, as I think Commissioner Levy pointed out, the 85% of what we were in 2019. So, you know, that is actually where it becomes incredibly challenging to provide service in the area is, you know, you've only got so many dollars to go around. So I throw that out to you in hopes that you can help us make sure that we're, you know, getting the best, get the best bang for our buck and get everything we can out of the dollars we have available. Julie?
You bet. Thanks. If you want to go to the next slide. So we talked about most of this, but just as a reminder to everyone, the SOP tool will be open until February 9th. Holly sent out with the meeting appointment a series of just a little toolkit. It's got some social media posts and some graphics and, you know, a little write-up. We would love your help getting the word out about this. So if it's something you could post on your website or add to a newsletter, we would be very, very appreciative. In the email, we said February 1st. We had gotten some feedback about wanting a little bit more time, so we did postpone it. So it has been extended to February 9th for the SOP online tool. In addition, we are moving forward with listening sessions. We're meeting individually with different municipalities. I will put my email address right now into the chat. If you have a group or yourself or anyone that you're working with that is interested in a one-on-one meeting to really get into the nuts and bolts, because this is so much volume. In some ways, it is easier to do small group meetings so you can really kind of focus on the individual routes. Please feel free to email. I would be happy to coordinate that with our team. We did have a series of service sector listening sessions and meetings late last year, early this year, and we are moving into February. We're going to do some customer panels, and again, really focusing on gathering the information, finalizing the SOP in the late February timeframe, presenting it to the board of directors in March. So that's for the SOP. For the mobility plan for the future, you're going to see the next couple of TWG and advisory committee meetings. You're going to see us really pivot, and we're going to be focusing a lot more on the mobility plan for the future. And we will be doing public outreach on the mobility plan for the future in the March timeframe and taking that document to the board of directors in the April timeframe. Next slide, please. So just as a quick reminder for these groups, we've got the February, we're going to be talking a lot about the mobility plan for the future. And again, we have a needs-based plan and a fiscally constrained long-term plan. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that. And in that March timeframe, we will have a draft of the mobility plan for the future for review. So what sort of questions do we have? Any other thoughts?
Real quick, this is now making me realize, does this mean this Reimagine process is coming to an end in April? Is that the end product we've been working towards?
Yes, so the actual product itself and then implementation will be continuing on after that. For the SOP, for example, that will be implemented as part of RTD's 3 times a year service change process. And then the mobility plan for the future will have a series of recommendations that then RTD will begin implementing. So it's not over, but the actual documentation will be finished by the April timeframe.
Thanks.
All right, any other questions or comments? That's all the material we have. We really appreciate your time and the input that you provided us today. I think that was really terrific. And same with yesterday with the technical working group. We got some really, really good information there. So very much appreciated. I always say, if you think of something later, please send an email. We want to continue to hear from you and get your feedback. So if you're falling asleep tonight and you have some great ideas, send it our way. That's all we've got, unless you got, I don't see any other hands. So I think we're good. We appreciate you joining us today. Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
We should probably stop the recording now too.